The Mysterious Nighttime Bark. Chapter 1. A Rough Night in Pawville. In the cozy town of Pawville, where fire hydrants stood proudly on every corner and the air always smelled faintly of bacon, there lived a most extraordinary dog. His name was Sherlock Bones, and he was the greatest canine detective the world had ever known. Sherlock was a beagle with a nose for mystery and a tail that wagged only when he was hot on the trail of a particularly puzzling case. His floppy ears were always perked up, listening for the slightest clue, and his warm brown eyes missed nothing. But what truly set Sherlock apart was the magnifying glass he always carried in his collar, a gift from his grandmother, who had been a famous bloodhound detective in her day. On this particular evening, Sherlock was lounging in his favorite armchair at 221 Billion Barker Street, his detective agency's headquarters. The office was a clutter of chew toys, old bones, and case files, but Sherlock knew where everything was, even if it sometimes took a bit of digging. His faithful friend and assistant, Dr. Woofson, was curled up nearby, his long dachshund body stretched out on a plush doggy bed. Woofson was busily typing up notes from their last case, the curious incident of the cat in the dog park, on a specially designed keyboard made for paws. "I say, Bones," Woofson yawned, his little legs stretching out even further. "Do you think we might have a quiet evening for once? I was rather hoping to catch up on my beauty sleep." Sherlock chuckled, his tail giving a slight wag. "My dear Woofson, you know as well as I do that crime never sleeps in Pawville, and neither do we when duty calls." No sooner had the words left Sherlock's mouth than there came a frantic pounding at the door. Both dogs' ears perked up instantly. "Come in," Sherlock called, sitting up straight in his chair. The door burst open, and in lumbered Officer Growl, the stout bulldog who headed up the Pawville Police Department. His usual gruff expression was replaced by one of genuine concern, his jowls quivering with each panted breath. "Sherlock." "Thank goodness you're here," Officer Growl wheezed. "We've got a situation on our paws, and I need your help." Sherlock's tail began to wag in earnest now. "Calm yourself, Officer Growl. Take a seat, catch your breath, and tell us everything." As Officer Growl settled his bulky frame onto a nearby cushion, Woofson trotted over with a bowl of water, which the bulldog lapped up gratefully. "It's madness out there," Sherlock Officer Growl began, his voice a low rumble. "For the past 3 nights, the entire town has been awakened by the most awful barking. It starts at midnight on the dot and goes on for hours. None of us can get a wink of sleep." Sherlock's brow furrowed. "Barking, you say? But surely that's not so unusual in a town full of dogs." Officer Growl shook his head vigorously, his jowls flapping. "This isn't ordinary barking, Sherlock. It's loud enough to wake the dead, and it seems to come from everywhere at once. And here's the real mystery. No one has actually seen the dog doing the barking." Sherlock's eyes gleamed with interest. "Fascinating. A phantom barker terrorizing the town. Tell me, Officer Growl, have you noticed any patterns to this mysterious noise?" The bulldog nodded. "That's just it, Sherlock. It always starts at the stroke of midnight, and it moves around town. One minute it sounds like it's coming from Poodle Park, the next it's over by the biscuit factory. We've had every available officer out searching, but we always seem to be one step behind." Sherlock stood up, his tail now a blur of excitement. A moving target, eh? And one with impeccable timing. Most intriguing indeed. He turned to his assistant. "Woofson, it seems our quiet evening will have to wait. The game is afoot, or should I say a paw." Woofson sighed but couldn't hide the glimmer of excitement in his eyes. I suppose I'll pack our investigation kit then, shall I? Capital idea, Woofson. Sherlock barked cheerfully. He turned back to Officer Growl, who was looking at him with hopeful eyes. Fear not, officer. We shall get to the bottom of this mysterious nighttime bark. But first, we must gather more information. Can you take us to some of the affected neighborhoods? Officer Growl nodded, relief evident in his saggy face. Of course, Sherlock. I've got a squad car waiting outside. As they prepared to leave, Sherlock paused at the door, his nose twitching with anticipation. Come, Woofson. The night awaits, and with it, the thrill of the chase. Our newest adventure begins. And with that, the trio of canine crime fighters set out into the streets of Pawville, ready to solve the mystery that had the whole town howling. Little did they know, this case would test their skills like never before, leading them on a wild adventure through dark alleys, spooky parks, and the very heart of their beloved town. The mysterious nighttime bark had only just begun to sound, and Sherlock Bones was determined to silence it once and for all. Chapter 2. Sniffing out clues. The squad car rumbled through the quiet streets of Pawville, its headlights cutting through the evening mist. Sherlock Bones sat in the front seat, his nose pressed against the window, taking in every scent in sight. In the back, Doctor. Woofson balanced their investigation kit on his lap, while Officer Growl drove, his paws gripping the wheel tightly. We'll start in the Fluffy Heights neighborhood, Officer Growl growled softly. That's where the barking was first reported 3 nights ago. As they turned onto Waggy Lane, the main street of Fluffy Heights, Sherlock's keen eyes scanned the surroundings. The houses here were all grand affairs, with perfectly manicured lawns and gilded fire hydrants. But something was off. Despite the early hour, every window was dark, and an eerie silence hung in the air. Most peculiar, Sherlock murmured. It's only 8 p.m., yet not a single dog is out for their evening constitutional. Officer Growl nodded grimly. That's how it's been since this all started. Everyone's too afraid to go out after dark now. They pulled up in front of a particularly impressive house, its facade adorned with ornate bone-shaped decorations. A sign on the mailbox read the Poodlestons. This is where we got our first complaint, Officer Growl explained as they climbed out of the car. Mrs. Poodleston is, well, you'll see. Before they could even reach the front door, it flew open, revealing a tall, elegant poodle with perfectly coiffed fur. Her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and indignation. Oh, thank goodness you're here. Officer Growl, she yapped shrilly. And you've brought. Who are these two? Sherlock stepped forward, giving a polite bow. Sherlock Bones, madam, at your service. And this is my associate, Dr. Woofson. We're here to investigate the mysterious barking that's been plaguing Pawville. Mrs. Poodleston's expression shifted from suspicion to relief. Well, it's about time. Do you have any idea what this has done to my beauty routine? 3 nights of interrupted sleep. My fur is an absolute disaster. Woofson coughed politely. Perhaps, Mrs. Poodleston, you could tell us exactly what you heard. The poodle sniffed haughtily but nodded. Very well. Come inside, all of you. I'll not discuss such vulgar matters on my doorstep. Once they were settled in Mrs. Poodleston's lavish living room, Sherlock and Woofson perched on silk cushions, while Officer Growl sat awkwardly on a delicate-looking chair. The poodle began her tale. It was precisely midnight, 3 nights ago. I had just finished my evening fur treatment when I heard it. The most dreadful, loud, uncouth barking I've ever heard. It sounded like it was coming from right outside my window, but when I looked, there was no one there. Sherlock leaned forward, his ears perked with interest. And how long did this barking continue, Mrs. Poodleston? Hours, she wailed. It would start and stop, move around, but it never truly ended until just before dawn. And it's been the same every night since. Woofson, who had been taking notes on a small pad, looked up. Did you notice any pattern to the barking? Any particular rhythm or message? Mrs. Poodleston looked scandalized. Message? My dear dog, it was noise, pure and simple. Although she paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Now that you mention it, there was something odd. Every so often, mixed in with the barking, I could have sworn I heard laughter. Sherlock's tail gave an excited twitch. Laughter, you say? Most intriguing. And tell me, Mrs. Poodleston, have you noticed anything else unusual in the neighborhood lately? Any new dogs moved in, perhaps? Or any strange occurrences before the barking began? The poodle thought for a moment, then gasped. Why, yes. Now that you mention it, there was something. About a week ago, I saw the most peculiar van parked down the street. It was painted with all sorts of ghastly cartoon bones and had Bonehead Brothers Circus written on the side. Can you imagine? A circus in Fluffy Heights. I called the neighborhood watch immediately, of course, and it was gone within the hour. Sherlock and Woofson exchanged meaningful glances. A circus van, Sherlock mused. Curiouser and curiouser. After a few more questions, which yielded little additional information, the detective team thanked Mrs. Poodleston and headed back outside. As they walked to the squad car, Sherlock's mind was racing. What do you make of it? Bones Woofson asked, struggling to keep up with his friend's longer strides. Sherlock's brow furrowed in concentration. We're dealing with something quite out of the ordinary, Woofson, a phantom barker with a sense of humor who can seemingly be in multiple places at once, and now this mysterious circus van. I fear this case may be more complex than we initially thought. Officer Growl, who had been quiet during the interview, spoke up. So what's our next move, Sherlock? The Beagle detective's eyes gleamed with determination. We need more data. Let's visit some of the other affected areas, and keep your eyes peeled for anything unusual, especially any signs of circus folk. As they drove off into the night, none of them noticed the pair of gleaming eyes watching them from the shadows of a nearby alley. As the squad car disappeared around a corner, a soft, mischievous chuckle echoed through the empty street, followed by the faintest whisper of a bark. The mystery of the nighttime barker was far from over. In fact, for Sherlock Bones and his friends, it was only just beginning. Chapter 3. Paw Prints and Popcorn. As Officer Growl's squad car patrolled the streets of Pawville, Sherlock Bones sat deep in thought, his brow furrowed and his tail occasionally twitching with bursts of insight. Doctor. Woofson watched his friend curiously, knowing that the great detective's mind was piecing together the puzzle even now. I say, Bones, Woofson ventured, what do you make of this circus business? Surely a group of performing dogs couldn't be behind all this mischief. Sherlock's eyes gleamed in the darkness. My dear Woofson, in all my years of solving mysteries, I've learned one vital lesson: never discount the impossible, for often it is merely the improbable in disguise. Officer Growl grunted from the driver's seat. Well, improbable or not, we're coming up on Biscuit Factory Row. This area's been hit hard by the barking, too. As they turned onto the street, lined with modest houses and small apartments. A commotion up ahead caught their attention. A crowd of dogs had gathered outside one of the buildings, their worried voices carrying through the night air. Well, Sherlock mused, his tail beginning to wag with excitement. It seems we've arrived at a most opportune moment. Shall we investigate, gentle dogs? The trio exited the car and made their way through the crowd. Dogs of all breeds and sizes were murmuring anxiously, some casting fearful glances at the sky, as if expecting the mysterious barker to appear at any moment. At the center of the gathering, they found a distraught-looking cocker spaniel being comforted by her neighbors. Sherlock approached gently, with Woofson and Officer Growl close behind. "Good evening, madam," Sherlock said softly. "I'm Sherlock Bones, and these are my colleagues, Dr. Woofson and Officer Growl. Might we inquire as to what has occurred here?" The cocker spaniel looked up, her long ears quivering. "Oh, Mr. Bones, thank goodness you're here. I'm Daisy Wagglesworth and I saw it." Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sherlock's ears perked up. "Saw what, exactly, Miss Wagglesworth?" Daisy took a deep breath. "The ghost dog. The one behind all the barking. It was horrible and wonderful all at once." Woofson pulled out his notepad, ready to take down every detail. "Please, Miss Wagglesworth, tell us everything you saw." "Well," Daisy began, her voice shaky, "I was out for my late-night constitutional. I work the night shift at the biscuit factory, you see. As I was walking home, I heard the barking start up. It was coming from Poodle Park, just down the street." She paused, looking around nervously before continuing. "Naturally, I was frightened, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer to the park, and that's when I saw a dog, glowing with an eerie blue light, floating above the ground." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Officer Growl's jowls quivered with disbelief, but Sherlock remained calm, his analytical mind racing. "Most interesting," he said. "Please continue. What did this apparition do?" Daisy's eyes widened as she recalled the scene. It was running in midair, chasing what looked like glowing butterflies. And the barking, oh, the barking was like nothing I've ever heard. It echoed and boomed, seeming to come from everywhere at once. But the strangest thing was the smell. Sherlock's nose twitched involuntarily. "Smell, you say? Do elaborate." "Popcorn," Daisy exclaimed. The air was filled with the scent of freshly popped popcorn. And just as I was trying to make sense of it all, the ghost dog turned and looked right at me. Its eyes were like swirling galaxies, and it actually smiled, before vanishing into thin air, taking the barking and the popcorn smell with it. As Daisy finished her tale, the crowd burst into excited chatter. Theories flew back and forth. Everything from alien dogs to government conspiracies was suggested. But Sherlock remained quiet, his mind working furiously. "Thank you, Miss Wagglesworth," he said finally. "You've provided us with some invaluable information. Now, if you'll excuse us, my team and I have some investigating to do." As they walked away from the crowd, Woofson turned to Sherlock. "What do you make of all this, Bones? Surely you don't believe in ghost dogs." Sherlock's tail wagged thoughtfully. "I believe in facts, my dear Woofson, and the facts here are most curious indeed. A glowing dog that can fly, the scent of popcorn, and a connection to a mysterious circus. The plot thickens, my friends." Officer Growl looked uncomfortable. "So what's our next move, Sherlock? Should we stake out Poodle Park?" "Patience. Officer Growl, Sherlock replied. First, we must gather more evidence. The nose knows, as they say, and right now my nose is telling me we should pay a visit to the biscuit factory. After all, our witness works there, and it might provide a clue as to why this area is being targeted. As they made their way towards the looming shape of the biscuit factory in the distance, none of them noticed the small drone hovering silently above them, its camera tracking their every move. Nor did they see the small figure operating it from the shadows, chuckling softly as it watched the detective team on a tiny screen. "Oh, Sherlock Bones," the figure whispered, its voice a mix of admiration and mischief. "You're good, but are you good enough to catch the mysterious barker? Let the real show begin." With a final quiet laugh, the figure pressed a button on its controller. In the distance, a faint barking began to echo through the streets of Pawville once more, heralding another night of canine chaos and another challenge for the greatest dog detective in the world. Chapter 4. The Secrets of the Biscuit Factory. The Pawville Biscuit Factory loomed before them, its brick walls casting long shadows in the moonlight. Despite the late hour, lights blazed from within, and the delicious aroma of baking treats wafted through the air, making Sherlock's nose twitch and Woofson's stomach growl. "Now remember," Sherlock said as they approached the main entrance, "we're here to investigate, not to snack. Stay focused, gentle dogs." Officer Growl nodded solemnly, but Woofson looked a bit disappointed. The bulldog stepped forward and pressed the buzzer with his paw. After a moment, a crackly voice came through the speaker. "Pawville Biscuit Factory, night shift. How can I help you?" "Officer Growl of the Pawville Police Department," the bulldog rumbled. "We need to ask a few questions about the recent disturbances in the area." There was a pause, then a buzz as the door unlocked. As they stepped inside, they were hit with a wave of warm, biscuity air that made their mouths water. The reception area was empty, but a sign pointed them towards the factory floor. As they pushed through the swinging doors, they found themselves in a cavernous room filled with conveyor belts, ovens and vats of delicious-smelling dough. Dogs of various breeds bustled about, all wearing hairnets and aprons. A portly saint, Bernard waddled over to greet them, a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Evening, officers. I'm Bernard Barkley, night shift manager. What seems to be the problem?" Sherlock stepped forward, extending a paw. "Sherlock Bones, private detective. We're investigating the mysterious barking that's been plaguing Pawville. We were hoping you might be able to provide some insights." Bernard's brow furrowed. "The ghost dog? Yeah, we've all heard it. Spooky business, that. But I don't see what it has to do with our little factory here." "Perhaps nothing," Sherlock mused, his keen eyes scanning the factory floor. "But we have reason to believe there might be a connection. Tell me, Mr. Barkley, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any new employees, strange occurrences, unexpected deliveries?" Bernard scratched his head with a large paw. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something odd last week. We got a big order for specialty biscuits, you know, the kind shaped like bones and fire hydrants. The customer wanted them extra crunchy, said they were for some kind of event." Woofson's ears perked up. "An event? Did they say what kind?" "Nope," Bernard shook his head. "Paid in cash, too, which is unusual for such a large order." Sherlock's tail began to wag with excitement. Most intriguing. And when was this order picked up? "That's the thing," Bernard lowered his voice conspiratorially. "It wasn't. At least not officially. The biscuits were all packed up and ready to go, but on the morning of the pickup they were just gone, vanished without a trace. We figured someone must have made a mistake and delivered them early, but nobody knew anything about it. Officer Grell growled softly. Sounds like theft to me. Why wasn't this reported? Bernard looked embarrassed. Well, the thing is, the payment cleared. So technically no crime was committed. We chalked it up to a clerical error and moved on. You know how it is in a factory this big, sometimes things get mixed up. Sherlock nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. Mr. Barkley, would it be possible for us to examine your security footage from that night? Sure thing, Bernard agreed. Follow me to the security office. As they walked, Sherlock noticed something on one of the conveyor belts. Just a moment, he said, trotting over to investigate. There, amid the regular round biscuits, was a single treat shaped like a circus tent. How curious, Sherlock murmured, picking up the biscuit with his paw. Mr. Barkley, do you often make circus-themed treats? Bernard looked surprised. No, that's not one of our usual shapes. Must be a mistake. Sherlock carefully wrapped the biscuit in a handkerchief and tucked it into his collar. A mistake, or perhaps a clue. Let's check that security footage, shall we? In the small, cluttered security office, Bernard pulled up the video from the night of the mysterious biscuit disappearance. As they watched, everything seemed normal until precisely midnight. Great googly moogly, Woofson exclaimed as the footage showed a bizarre scene unfolding. On the screen, a group of small, shadowy figures appeared as if from thin air. They moved with incredible speed and agility, forming a canine pyramid to reach the packed biscuits on the high shelves. Within minutes, every box was gone, and the mysterious intruders vanished as quickly as they had appeared. I've never seen anything like it, Officer Grell said, his jowls quivering with astonishment. Sherlock leaned in close to the screen, his nose nearly touching it. Pause it there, he barked. Bernard obliged, freezing the image on a frame where one of the shadowy figures was caught in the light. Well, Sherlock said, his tail wagging furiously. It seems our culprits are not ghosts after all, but rather puppies. Indeed, the paused image clearly showed a small, mischievous-looking puppy face, its eyes gleaming with excitement. But how? Woofson wondered aloud. How could puppies move so fast and disappear like that? Sherlock turned to his companions, his eyes shining with the thrill of discovery. My friends, I believe we're dealing with no ordinary puppies. These are circus puppies, highly trained, incredibly agile, and equipped with some very advanced technology. He held up the circus tent-shaped biscuit. This, combined with Mrs. Poodleston's sighting of the circus van and Miss Wagglesworth's encounter with the ghost dog, all point to one conclusion: the Bonehead Brothers Circus is behind these nocturnal disturbances. As if on cue, a distant barking began to echo through the night, growing louder by the second. The game's afoot, Sherlock declared. Quick to Poodle Park. We may yet catch our mysterious barker in the act. As they raced out of the factory, none of them noticed the small, blinking device attached to the underside of Officer Grell's collar, a tiny speaker that had been surreptitiously placed there during the confusion of their arrival. High above Pawville, in a colorful hot air balloon shaped like a giant dog bowl, a figure watched their progress on a tablet screen. Oh, Sherlock, the figure chuckled. You're good, but are you good enough to catch the greatest show that never was? Time for the grand finale. With a flourish, the figure pressed a button, and suddenly the night sky above Pawville erupted in a spectacular display of colorful, bone-shaped fireworks. The mysterious barking reached a crescendo, echoing from every corner of the town. The final act of the mysterious nighttime bark was about to begin, and Sherlock Bones was racing headlong into the performance of a lifetime. Chapter 5. The Greatest Show That Never Was. Poodle Park was a cacophony of light and sound as Sherlock Bones, Dr. Woofson, and Officer Growl arrived on the scene. The sky above was alive with dazzling fireworks, painting the night in a kaleidoscope of colors. Bone-shaped explosions burst overhead, raining down sparkles that faded just before touching the ground. But it was the barking that truly astonished them. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees, the bushes, even the sky itself. And mixed with the barks were yips of joy, playful growls, and what sounded suspiciously like giggles. "Great Scotland Yard!" Woofson exclaimed, his long ears twitching in every direction. "What in the world is going on here?" Sherlock's eyes gleamed with excitement. "What's going on, my dear Woofson, is the greatest show that never was. Look there." He pointed with his paw, and as they watched, shapes began to materialize in the air. Ghostly puppies, glowing with an ethereal blue light, frolicked and played, chasing each other and the colorful fireworks. Officer Growl's jaw dropped. But how? Are they real? Sherlock shook his head, his tail wagging furiously. "Not ghosts, my friend, but holograms. Incredibly sophisticated ones at that. And if I'm not mistaken—" He was cut off by a booming voice that echoed across the park. "Ladies and gentle dogs, prepare yourselves for the spectacle of a lifetime. The Bonehead Brothers Circus proudly presents the Midnight Barkers." With a flash and a puff of smoke that smelled curiously like popcorn, a figure appeared in the center of the park. It was a Jack Russell Terrier, wearing a glittery top hat and a red ringmaster's coat. In one paw, he held a shiny whistle, and in the other, a high-tech remote control. "Aha!" Sherlock barked triumphantly. "Just as I suspected. The mastermind behind our mysterious nighttime disturbances." The Jack Russell turned, his eyes widening as he spotted Sherlock and his team. For a moment he looked surprised, but then a mischievous grin spread across his face. "Well, well. If it isn't the great Sherlock Bones himself. I was wondering when you'd catch up. Allow me to introduce myself, Jasper Barkley, ringmaster extraordinaire of the Bonehead Brothers Circus." Woofson gasped. "Barkley? Any relation to Bernard Barkley from the biscuit factory?" Jasper chuckled. "My dear Uncle Bernard. He always was a bit oblivious. The perfect cover for our little operation." Officer Growl growled, stepping forward. "Operation? You mean disturbing the peace and stealing biscuits?" "Stealing?" Jasper looked offended. "My good officer, we paid for those biscuits fair and square. As for disturbing the peace, well, I prefer to think of it as enhancing the nightlife." Sherlock stepped forward, his keen eyes taking in every detail of Jasper's equipment. "Very clever, Mr. Barkley. Holographic puppies, ventriloquism through hidden speakers, and if I'm not mistaken, scent dispensers for that popcorn smell. All to create the illusion of a supernatural circus." Jasper's grin widened. "I'm impressed, Mr. Bones. You've got it all figured out. But the question is, can you stop the show?" With a flourish, Jasper blew his whistle. Suddenly the park erupted into chaos. Real puppies wearing glow-in-the-dark collars burst from hiding places all around them. They were of all breeds and sizes, moving with incredible agility and precision. "You see, Mr. Bones," Jasper called out as he nimbly dodged Sherlock's attempt to catch him. "This was all an audition. Pawville has been our stage, and every citizen an unwitting audience member." As Sherlock, Woofson, and Officer Growl tried to corral the acrobatic puppies, Jasper continued his monologue. "For years, the Bonehead Brothers Circus has been overlooked, forgotten in this age of digital entertainment. So we decided to create a mystery, a spectacle so intriguing that it would capture the imagination of every dog in town." Woofson, who was unsuccessfully trying to catch a pair of tumbling corgi puppies, called out, "But why all the secrecy? Why not just put on a regular circus?" Jasper laughed, backflipping over a bush to avoid Officer Growl's lunge. "In this day and age, please, we needed something viral, something that would get every muzzle talking. And what better publicity than the great Sherlock Bones himself trying to solve our little mystery?" Sherlock, who had been quietly observing the patterns of the puppy's movements, suddenly sprang into action. With a series of quick, precise movements, he began herding the puppies towards the center of the park. "Ingenious, Mr. Barkley," Sherlock called out as he worked. "But did you consider that while you were auditioning Pawville, Pawville was also auditioning you?" Jasper's grin faltered for the first time. "What do you mean?" Sherlock's tail wagged as his plan came together. The puppies, responding to his expert herding, had begun to form a circle around Jasper. "You see, Mr. Barkley, Pawville may be a small town, but we appreciate a good show, and you've certainly given us one." As if on cue, the bushes and trees around the park rustled, and dogs of all shapes and sizes emerged. There was Mrs. Poodleston, looking both frazzled and fascinated. Daisy Wagglesworth stood with her biscuit factory co-workers, all wagging their tails in excitement. Even Bernard Barkley was there, looking sheepish but amused. "Ladies and gentle dogs of Pawville," Sherlock announced, his voice carrying across the park, "I present to you the mastermind behind our mysterious nighttime barker Jasper Barkley and his incredible midnight barkers." To Jasper's astonishment, the crowd began to cheer and applaud. Confused puppies looked around, tails wagging uncertainly. Officer Growl stepped forward, looking stern but with a twinkle in his eye. "Jasper Barkley, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace, unauthorized use of public space," and he paused, looking at the delighted faces around him, "for putting on a spectacular show without a proper license." Jasper's shoulders slumped in defeat, but there was a hint of a smile on his muzzle. "Well played, Mr. Bones. I suppose the jig is up." But Sherlock wasn't finished. "Not quite, Mr. Barkley. You see, while your methods were undoubtedly against town regulations, your showmanship is undeniable. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement that satisfies both the law and Pawville's newfound appetite for spectacle." And so, as the sun began to rise over Pawville, a most unusual negotiation took place in Poodle Park. By breakfast time, an agreement had been reached. The Bonehead Brothers Circus would become Pawville's official entertainment troupe, putting on regular shows in the park with proper permits, of course. Jasper would pay a fine for his past transgressions, and the puppies would be enrolled in Pawville's obedience school, though some suspected they might end up teaching the classes instead of taking them. As Sherlock, Woofson, and Officer Growl walked back to 221 Billion Barker Street, tired but satisfied, Woofson turned to his friend. "I must say, Bones, that was quite the performance. How did you know it would all work out?" Sherlock's tail wagged contentedly. Elementary, my dear Woofson. In all my years of solving mysteries, I've learned that sometimes the best solution is not to end the show, but to ensure it goes on this time with everyone playing their proper part. Officer Growl nodded approvingly. Well said, Sherlock. Though I have to ask, how did you know I had that speaker on my collar? Sherlock chuckled. My dear Officer Growl, a detective must always be aware of every detail, especially when that detail is broadcasting dog whistles directly behind one's sensitive ears. As they laughed together, heading home for a well-deserved rest, the streets of Pawville were abuzz with excitement. Posters were already going up for the first official performance of the Midnight Barkers, a Pawville spectacular. And if, in the weeks that followed, the citizens of Pawville sometimes heard mysterious barks in the night or caught glimpses of glowing puppies in the park, well, they simply smiled and wagged their tails, happy to be part of the greatest show that almost never was. The end.